966.
This is the 966, episode 21. Blackjack, Richard. Mabruk.
Yes, shukran.
Joining us today, a very special guest, David Des Roches, Associate Professor at the National Defense University and a non-resident fellow, Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. David has had a distinguished career in the Army as well as with the Department of Defense as well. Dave, so glad to have you join us today.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Today we'll be taking advantage of Dave's expertise and talking about Saudi defense issues and U.S. Saudi security topics. But before we take the plunge this week, thanks to all of those of you who have subscribed wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google, Stitcher, Spotify. Also, shout out to our YouTube fam. What up, YouTube fam? Okay, let's get going. Richard, what's your one big thing this week?
Outside of the views, just rocketing. Well done, the 966. My one big thing. Just 4 years after removal of the kingdom's 35-year-old ban on movie theaters, Saudi Arabia's 2021 theater box office revenues hit $238 million, making it the top market in West Asia for the second straight year. For reference, that $238 million was close to 100% higher than 2020, which was $122 million, which is not surprising given the pandemic year. But it's also more than $100 million more than UAE's box office gross in 2021. 340 new feature films were released in Saudi cinemas in 2021, again up from 222 in 2020. The surge in Saudi box office grosses coincides with the growth of multiplexes from 33 locations at the beginning of the year, 2021, to 53 by December. Saudi Arabia now has 430 screens. Saudi-owned movie cinemas operates the highest number of local cinemas with 21. Dubai-based Vox has 15. U.S. theater chain AMC has 10. We did a segment on them and their challenges in getting rolling. Lebanon's Empire Cinema with 5, and Mexican-owned Cinépolis has 2 multiplexes.
Awesome. As you know, I don't really like movie theaters. This was even before the pandemic, so but that's really cool. Dave, feel free to jump in here.
Well, this is really just a symptom of what's going on. I mean, 5 years ago, if you had a bunch of Westerners in the kingdom, somebody would come in and say, "Oh my God, you wouldn't believe what I just saw. What? I drove through Burger King and a Saudi was working there." And it was like they saw a unicorn walking down the street. And now, the country has transformed in ways that is profound for those of us who go back and forth to the kingdom, and it's largely unknown in the West, but it really is a profound transformation, and this growth of cinemas is a pretty visible attribute of that.
Yeah, it's you put your finger on it. People hear about it, but they don't believe it. I was laughing with Lucien that when I first went to the Saudi in the 80s, entertainment was sharing banned VHS tapes.
Yeah.
That was, if you got a good one, it was awesome. And when my friends would come here, Saudi friends would come here, part of the process, if they're in for 2 weeks or a week and a half or whatever, visiting a son or a daughter or whatever, they say, leave me alone for about 4 days because I want to go to the movie theater. I want to go see some things that I can't see back home. Yeah, it's a different world for sure.
Yeah. And the cultural aspect of it is becoming so intertwined where, you see people who, wear T-shirts with professional wrestlers on them and stuff like that. I mean, it's profound and it's so rapid. And I fear because of COVID, a lot of people are really missing out on this. They're going to see a great step. It's been sort of a gradual thing, but when people start going back to the kingdom in numbers, there's going to be a lot of people really amazed. We'll see a lot of articles.
Yeah. It's also worthwhile to note that the top grossing film was Egyptian comedy. So it's not all just, U.S. blockbusters. And actually 2 of the top 5 were Egyptian comedies. Spider-Man was the biggest, U.S. production to make it, and that came in at 2. But of the top 10, there's a number of Middle East Arab-based productions, which is I guess it's not surprising given there, but these increasingly, and we've covered the Red Sea Film Festival and a number of other things. You'll see more and more of that, where you're going to see more regional and local productions making it to the screen.
That's great.
Definitely. Okay, Richard, my one big thing this week, I'll just jump right into it. I can't resist this topic, Saudi golf. There's a new podcast out from Golf Digest that really does a great job at giving the history of Greg Norman's pursuit to shake up the game. As you both know, Saudi Arabia announced last fall it would be partnering up with Greg Norman, the Shark, for a $200 million venture called Live Golf Investments to increase the popularity of the game outside the U.S. and Europe. Greg Norman is Live's chief executive officer. As you both might know, this is the latest Saudi-backed effort. It isn't Norman's first pony ride at the county fair. Norman tried unsuccessfully to start a competing tour in the 90s, and the podcast really captures why Norman was doing it then and how a few folks in the PGA successfully torpedoed the plans. It's just like a really interesting look at what was going on then and what Greg Norman is doing now. The podcast also features an interview with Norman himself. It sort of changed the way how I'm thinking about this, mostly in that I believe Norman, in that he's doing this to grow the game of golf and solve some longstanding problems with the PGA. For example, Norman believes that the PGA's insistence on not having appearance fees and tightly regulating where players can play is stunting the growth of the sport. The PGA decided to kick the can down the road this spring and grant waivers to a host of the sport's biggest names to play in the upcoming Saudi International. So we'll have to wait to see, wait to break the popcorn out on the PGA versus Saudi League sort of head-to-head battle coming up. Anyway, highly suggest that you check it out. It's on golfdigest.com, but we also have it on our website, sustg.com. Dave, do you play golf?
Not well. I play about twice a year. And usually I like to play, it's more, more of the Churchillian, a good walk spoiled. But I was thinking about getting into golf serious, but the problem is it's so time consuming and expensive. Mm-hmm. So I decided to smoke crack instead.
Well, I love golf. I really would like to play more, and I'm trying to play more, but I'm not very good at it. And it just occurs to me I might be better at smoking crack. So, Dave, let's
it's cheaper.
That episode was good, and Greg Norman. I agree with what you said, Lucien. But Greg Norman still holds a grudge. We know he does, and it's been interesting to watch this whole process where the Saudis talked about doing this Super League, and then went ahead and invested in the Asian League, and it's and then the PGA partnering with the Dubai Ports League, but it was a European circuit in order to really compete and meet some of these desires of their top flight players. So they're all sort of meeting in the middle. It's all coming up, and the Saudi vision in this Super League that was envisioned and has sort of come to the fore a couple times is clearly going to win the day, in my opinion, because we're going to have more of these very large, high-purse events with just the top performers who are getting appearance fees, which is sort of the format that everyone's talking about. So it's been an interesting process to see it go.
Yeah, it's kind of like I think what we're going to see is golf is going to become sort of like the F1, but if you had alternate circuits of F1 where people come to Manama and other places, but they don't do it for free. And I think there's a recognition. The Saudis recognize that they're going to have a sort of top-down approach for a while, at least, before the game takes root. But it's encouraging. I mean, sport. People talk about all the industrial goals for Vision 2030, but one of them is that every Saudi is going to exercise on a regular basis. People neglect that social aspect of Vision 2030, and anything that promotes sport is a good thing. I wish I golfed more, and I wish I golfed better. I've only played 3 holes in the Kingdom, so I look forward to doing it again.
Dave, you're clearly a regular listener of the 966, because we often talk about the quality of life plank of that Vision 2030, that quality of life pillar, and that participation, and how these sports initiatives that get the front pages and that sort of thing. We're talking all the way from Newcastle and soccer to golf to Formula One. They are criticized for being sports washing, but how it ties back into real goals back home in terms of participation and health and finding outlets for their youth. And I will say this: if the golf, the Asian Tour or even the PGA could have a season exciting as this last F1 season, which was insanely exciting, then that's must-see TV. That would really build their base.
Yeah, no, it's good. People tend to regard sports and politics and social development as separate, but they really are fundamentally entwined. You look at the battle for racial integration in the United States, and there's a reason why, Jackie Robinson's number is retired at every professional baseball team. And then conversely, on the negative side, if you look at the birth of modern Quebec independence, it goes back to the Montreal Canadiens riots after Rocket Richard was unjustly suspended for an alleged dirty hit. That led to a riot in Montreal in the 50s. And most Canadian historians, and I realize we're delving into a very, very obscure area when you talk about anything with Canada being significant, but the political ferment that led to modern Quebec secessionism, martial law in Montreal in the 70s, they stem that all from that hockey match. So it can be significant, and I think the kingdom's wise to focus on it.
Yeah, agreed.
It's interesting too. Norman's whole point about the appearance fees thing is like, if you're starting up a new league and you're starting up a new tournament and it's in a place where golf typically is not terribly popular, or there really isn't a large fan base for the sport, you need to pay people to show up. And part of the reason why you do that is because that then gets people to attend the events. It gets, sponsors and interest. It sort of generates its own money back when you're doing that. It's just a good way to get things started. So for Saudi Arabia or Indonesia or any of these other countries to do this is like, it's an important way for them to get things going. So it's interesting to see the players sort of come back and forth across the spectrum on this. Some people saying, look, I don't want to do politics. I don't care. I'm going to play in Saudi Arabia and take the money. And others are saying, yeah, I mean, I don't know about where the money's coming from. I'm worried about this and that. It's like the players are independent contractors. They can sort of do what they want. And that's the essence of the battle right now. And that's sort of why I thought that was interesting with that podcast, just talking about that angle of it. Because I think that is Greg Norman's like number one thing that he's working on.
It was interesting back in the day when he first mooted this in the mid-'90s. It was basically kiboshed by Arnold Palmer.
Yeah.
So, Jack and Gary Player and I were the threesome, and we didn't. Everyone invited us to go out on our own and do our own little bit, and we didn't because we didn't think it'd be good for the game. The game has changed.
Yeah.
And I actually think we're going to be coming to a head at some point, because the PGA is going to have to either cave, or they're going to have to try and draw a line in the sand, and then these independent contractors, and it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out.
Yeah, I mean, basically what you're describing is not too different from the PGA Seniors Tour, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that is, not a hyper competitive league, and it's fan driven, and there's appearance fees and stuff like that. So, we already have sort of a precedent there within the domestic context. So I don't think it'd be that hard to export the model. And clearly it meshes nicely with what the kingdom is seeking to do for both enhancing its stage, giving it a reputation as a place to actually go to for something other than business. And I think, what the heck? I mean, more golf is better. There have been wars over soccer games, but there's never been a war over golf.
Well, back to Saudi. I mean, Aramco is very much involved in the Ladies European Tour, and so they're trying to build the sport across the genders in Saudi Arabia, and it's not just men. So back to the PGA, they just put in this Player Impact program, which is a $40 million pool. Mm-hmm. Which Phil Mickelson got $8 million for this year, for basically because it's in response to what these leagues, the competitive leagues, are saying is you have to pay your marquee players, and so they said, all right, here's a $40 million pot, and we'll have some quotient that lets us know who has done the most to promote the game of golf, and again, so Phil, just for being Phil, got 5% of that $40 million. To add to his, I'm sure it was a really scraggly year. He didn't make enough money, so another $8 million.
My mother lives in La Jolla in San Diego, and Phil Mickelson owns all the Five Guys. in San Diego. and I can tell you, whenever my mom gives me like and she golfs occasionally, she plays Torrey Pines and all that.
Wow.
Whenever she gives me, well, it's a municipal golf course in San Diego. If you live in San Diego, it's affordable. And whenever she gives me clothes, I can always tell that basically the picture she has in her mind's eye is Phil Mickelson. She wants me to look like Phil Mickelson.
Well, look.
So I resent him.
Until his recent diet, and he looked like he frequented those Five Guys.
Yeah, that's right. Not just the owner, but a customer. Yeah,
Yes, exactly. I stand by my product.
yeah.
Dave, I have just one more follow-up question. Where did you play your 3 holes in Saudi Arabia?
At a residential compound in Riyadh.
Cool. Why only 3 holes?
Well, it's schedule time, and apparently you're supposed to pay green fees, and I thought it was free. So when I saw somebody coming my way, I hightailed it in the opposite direction. I was basically, but I mean that brings out a good point about golf and why it may be good for the kingdom. If you're trying to do, like Dubai has gone in big for cricket, but you got to have 22 players to play cricket. Golf you can play by yourself. Women can play against men. You hit off the different tees. The handicap system allows. It's kind of like skiing. You're really playing against the course. And so theoretically, with a handicap, a gifted amateur can play against a professional. I mean, there's an ecological argument against golf, but in terms of participation and broadening it really. Paradoxically, for such an expensive sport, once you get onto the greens, it's actually a very democratic sport that transcends gender and everything else like that. So I think it's there's a lot to be said for it.
And it's a lifetime sport.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, an old guy like me can go out and
me.
Yeah.
I can defile courses anywhere around the world until I die.
Yeah, I'll be hacking up divots until I'm 90. Yeah.
Usually when I don't finish or when I only play 3 holes, it's because I can't get the ball in the hole on any of the 3 holes. So I just say, all right,
I'm picking up.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, let's move on to our first of 2 security-related topics today, since we have an expert with us. David, you wrote a great piece recently for the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington on Saudi Arabia's Patriot buys and the political aspects of missile defense. As you note in the article, Saudi security conditions are, quote, continuing to deteriorate. Over 300 attacks have been launched into the kingdom in the last year alone. And the current problem is that the kingdom is running out of missiles to defend itself against such attacks from Iran and the Iranian-backed Houthis in Yemen. This seems just like a great place to start. For our listeners, really quickly, check out his piece for the AGSIW, which is just fantastic. But I'm going to kick it over to you, Dave. Let's talk a little bit about the status of the U.S. Saudi security relationship.
Yeah, good question. So it's still robust. It's still very active. There's still a large presence, American presence in the kingdom, and that presence is focused on enabling Saudi capacities. Most people think that there are U.S. offensive capabilities in Saudi Arabia. That wasn't the case from 2003 to 2019. After the Abqaiq attacks, the United States agreed to put some more, actual combat forces in. But most of the presence is actually training, advising, assisting, things like that. And that's still robust. So in the last year, I've lectured for 2 weeks at Saudi War College, which is amazing. You think about that, an American doing that. There's ongoing upgrades and modernizations across the spectrum of the Saudi defense establishment. But what has happened is, particularly during the Trump administration, 2 things. First, you've had the rise of the Crown Prince, which remains controversial, and the actions of the Crown Prince, are controversial. Then you had the war in Yemen, which has not gone well. And has kind of become a sort of litmus test for people who are unhappy with Saudi Arabia. And then, because President Trump was so inartful in expressing policies that, quite frankly, are exactly the same as Barack Obama had, but poorly sold. People forget the war in Yemen started. If there was an American green light for the war in Yemen, that was given by Barack Obama. But people forget that. And during the Trump administration, opposing Saudi Arabia became sort of a proxy way of opposing Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. So you have Joe Biden, in the presidential campaign saying Saudi Arabia needs to be made a pariah. Well, then he becomes president, and there's a long-standing conflict there, and the rules of governments are very different from the rules of campaigning. And so the question is, okay, what do we do with this long-standing security partner? What the Biden administration has done is what we see quite frequently, and I think it's a false distinction. They said, well, we'll only sell defensive weapons, not offensive weapons. Some weapons are easier to make that case for than others. Patriot, which is a ground-to-air missile system, that intercepts that. Other systems like precision-guided munitions that have been used in the Yemen war are harder. So the Biden administration is trying to thread the needle here. It's trying to keep its own party base from outset revolt. There are some people in the Democratic Party who want to see a total cessation of the security relationship with the kingdom until the crown prince steps down, until the war in Yemen stops, et cetera, et cetera. The pragmatic wing is trying to say, okay, these weapons good, these weapons bad. But meanwhile, it's without doubt that Saudi Arabia is under constant attack by missiles provided by Iran. In the next 5 years, probably domestically produced. And they need support, and they're running out of Patriot missiles. So, what we're seeing now is the Biden administration going forward with that on a commercial basis and probably on a foreign military sales basis. And meanwhile, there are reports that the Saudis are buying excess Patriot from their other GCC partners. They've bought them from Greece. That requires U.S. approval. So it looks as though the United States is, on board with this effort at least, and we'll see where the rest of it goes.
Yeah, it's a bad look, I think, from the U.S. perspective in terms of a partner in this kind of being attacked on a regular basis and having a shortage of U.S. munitions and that sort of thing. But I want to get to a point you made early on and come back to some others. You mentioned that the nature of the relationship is changing in terms of its training. And my understanding is we've had the U.S. military training mission. You submit them, and then also Saudi Arabia National Guard modernization. So OPM sang, since the 50s and the 70s. Mm-hmm. I mean, they've been in there a long time. Has training Saudis, and they're sort of point of the spear in terms of the relationship, in terms of that the U.S. Saudi relationship at that level on the ground. And this is really, in my opinion, this and the business community, defense and business community, are the sort of basic sinews of the relationship, because these are where real relationships are struck, long-standing commitments are made, and you have an opportunity to get to know people over time and come to trust people over time. So are things you mentioned, was it 02 to 2019?
It's 03 to 2019. Yeah, was when our combat forces left Saudi Arabia.
All right. So have things changed on the ground in terms of how the U.S. is interacting with its Saudi counterparts in the military?
Yeah, that's a good question. They have generally. There's more positive mood. So, you have the Ministry of Defense Forces. That relationship goes back to the 50s, as you said, and that seems to be on track. The issue, of course, is the administration has said that it's not going to transfer certain kind of offensive weapons. The difference between offensive and defensive weapons is really a geopolitical concept. It's a political concept. It's not a military concept. I went through the Joint Staff Dictionary trying to find a definition of defensive weapons. There's no such thing. But that's a political problem. In terms of the ongoing basis, the training, the assisting, as much as the Saudis want, they get. So, one of the things that I'm involved with is we have a foreign military sales case to help the Saudis stand up a national defense university on the lines of the American National Defense University. And that is really revolutionary. In the past, not just the Saudis, but most security partners of the United States tend to be very equipment focused. I call it the Wile E. Coyote model of defense capacity building. They go through the Acme calendar. They say, okay, we got a problem with drones. All right, here's the Acme drone hunter. Buy it, and that'll solve the problem. But the Saudis have actually said, no, one of the reasons why we are not performing at the level we think we should is because we haven't developed a culture of critical thinking. And so we need to have a war college, a staff college that actually does these, an associated institution that looks at complex issues of developments to get our armed forces ahead. And that's a multi-million-dollar effort where, we've gone from having one officer who, is on scene to, trained war college faculty, academic faculty, military officers working with the Saudis on that. There's been some other areas where it's unclear what's going on. So the relationship with the National Guard and the training through the Vanel Arabia Corporation has been in place since the 70s. In the last 4 months, the ground component of that has just stopped. And we don't know whether that's because of a conscious decision. People have always, from the outside, are always wondering, is the National Guard, which is basically a redundant army, is it going to be folded into the Ministry of Defense? Are they running it down? We don't know. I mean, the United States has a second army. We have the army that belongs to the United States. We have the army that belongs to the United States Navy, called the United States Marine Corps. So, having this redundancy is not unheard of. But it is, this relationship with the ground forces of the Saudi National Guard from the 1970s until now, and it just ended in the last quarter of last year. So we don't know whether that means they're going to be run down, or whether they just ran out of money, or whether, there was mismanagement, or, we don't know what the deal was with that. The case for the air component of the National Guard is ongoing. So maybe there was a prioritization, we don't know. But in terms of the actual military to military, that's pretty much unchanged. It remains robust. The Saudis are never quite happy with what they get from the United States. The United States is never quite happy with what they see as an unending demand signal from the Saudis. But I don't see any real change in that.
That's a really useful and I think insightful sort of overview of where it is at the working level. I think I'm always interested on any kind of perspective on what the Saudis feel about the relationship, and particularly since Abqaiq and Quraysh in 2019. Mm-hmm. This attack was stunning, really. Complete surprise. That they weren't prepared for. This is a processing facility that deals with half of their production. I mean, it's just an extraordinary blow in terms of economic, the Saudi's economy. And
well, hold on though. Let's give Aramco some credit. Okay, so I think prior to the attack, if you said there was going to be a coordinated, attack by cruise missiles and drones on Abqaiq, how long would it take to get it back in business? And people would say 6 months, a year. It would be catastrophic. And because of resiliency, yes, the active defense measures failed. But the resiliency, which is more important, the passive defense, the fact that they had spares online, that they had trained staff who knew to shut down valves so there wasn't secondary explosions, all that. Abqaiq was back online in 2 weeks, and the effect on the global energy market was momentary. So there was preparation. It just wasn't in the military and security realm.
I mean, and that's a good point, and that's something we spoke of actually in our last episode when we were talking about the global oil market and the ability. Saudi Arabia is moving from 12 million to 13 million barrels in terms of capacity, and they hope to get there by 2027. But they just put in 4.5 billion into the Zuluf offshore field. The point being is that speaks what you're talking about. That speaks to the Saudi governance and how they've managed their resources, and the fact that they have built-in resiliency and redundancy, and they have spent enormous billions to not only achieve a certain capacity but also preserve the ability to rebound. But I don't think that gives them much comfort that they can bounce back after being revealed to be so vulnerable. And I guess that's what I'm trying to get to. How do the Saudis see this, and do they feel? And obviously they're aware. I think everyone has a different take on Afghanistan, and I'm not sure everyone's is correct, or mine may be different. But certainly the Saudis, the question, and to be honest, from their perspective is, apart from a few more Patriot batteries, nothing happened.
Good question.
After that attack. Saudis, how do the Saudis look at this?
Yeah, I think after the attack on Abqaiq, they expected to see the U.S. Air Force bombing, Isfahan. They expected to see a response in kinetic terms. And, one of the things, Donald Trump was a bombastic, undisciplined speaker. He spoke a lot, but when you look at what he actually did, he's the only president in the last 20 years who didn't start another war in the Middle East. He actually, his baseline instincts were pacifistic. And when the Iranians shot down a Global Hawk drone, a U.S. Navy Global Hawk drone in the Straits of Hormuz, there were aircraft en route to bomb, Iranian targets. And Trump reportedly said, wait a minute, nobody was killed on this. I'm not going to start a war, over equipment, called them back. What we're hearing is that there was a cyber attack against the Iranian infrastructure, but clearly that didn't satisfy the Saudi desire.
This post-Abqaiq.
Post-Abqaiq, yeah.
Yeah, there was a cyber attack.
With that the U.S. directed cyber stuff like that. But, what the Saudis expected was a parallel sort of kinetic,
right.
They wanted to see bombs landing on Iranian infrastructure. And, it's a good question. If that's what they expected, we got to ask ourselves, why did they expect that? And it's because of statements and actions we've taken, or statements and actions we haven't taken. And, if the nature of the relationship is one that they are not comfortable with, it calls for high level discussions as to, what exactly, we're willing to do for them. The other problem is, you're right about Afghanistan. In the U.S. government, Afghanistan is seen as its own problem. In the Pentagon, Afghanistan is it belongs to a separate Assistant Secretary of Defense than the Middle East. The Middle East starts at Egypt and ends at the Iranian-Afghan border. And that goes up to the Assistant Secretary for International Security Affairs, which is going to be Celeste Wallander de Winter. She has her hearing, I think, today. And then the Afghanistan, Pakistan belong to the Assistant Secretary for East Asia, who spends 98% of his time dealing with China and Korea and Japan. So, we have it bifurcated. We see them as two different issues. And I never worked Afghanistan in the Pentagon. I worked it in the Army on the ground, but I did work Pakistan. And I can tell you that most of the issues being dealt with were Afghanistan as its own issue, or Afghanistan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Central Asia, wasn't seen as having any impact on the Middle East except as a logistic base. But the problem is, first off, the Iranians saw it as encirclement from the East. By the way, kind of funny, if we encircle them from the East, the fact that we've left should mean that they could stand down some of their military capacity, but they haven't. And then our friends in the Gulf, I'm sorry I'm being a little long-winded here, but our friends in the Gulf said, you're in the neighborhood, you're gone, we're naked. And I'm not quite sure how we can deal with those perceptions. There is this perception, and quite frankly, I've felt it since the announcement of the pivot in the Obama administration in 2009. And the pivot was away from Europe, not from the Middle East. But ever since that was announced, folks in the region have said, oh my God, the Americans are leaving, we're on our own, the Iranians are going to, reduce us to servitude. And I don't know how you can, it's like arguing with your wife, when you say you're being irrational, oh my God, you can't argue a person into seeing that. Yeah.
Well, and this is the challenge we have, because that certainly the perception is out there of a U.S. that's distracted, withdrawing, and consciously redirecting. And you see at the end of 2021, Jake Sullivan, Brett McGurk, a series of senior administrative officials, although Secretary of Defense Austin did not stop in Saudi, going out there to try and reassure them, and I gather that some of the there's been some redeployment to the west of the country in terms of assets and that sort of thing, but it is a challenge, as you say, because your discussion of theater management and marshaling the U.S., how the U.S. addresses the area, doesn't resonate with them. They see something entirely different, and they feel something entirely different. And I think it's a real challenge. It seems to be a real challenge to try and reassure them if there's something to reassure them about.
Yeah, no, the problem is, and this is not limited to the Middle East. You see this in Japan and Korea and Europe. If you have U.S. forces based someplace, the host nation tends to view those as our forces. So, one of the challenges I've argued in print that we should never put an aircraft carrier in the Gulf. It's stupid. It limits the ability of the aircraft carrier. The ships around it have to devote all their energy to protecting the aircraft carrier that should be in the missile defense mode. Right. Be better to have, sort of isolated bases on the Arab side of the Gulf, fly the planes in there, project the power that way. That way you have something that can't be sunk and kill 2,000 people at once. But, very senior people in the Saudi government and other are like, why is there not an aircraft carrier in the Gulf? They freak out over that. They've come to see it as an entitlement. And when it's not there, they see it as the United States sort of reneging on informal security commitments.
So sorry to interrupt, if I were listening to this conversation, I might conclude that it's a communication breakdown. Is that all it is? Or are there some philosophical changes?
Well, there's a couple of problems. So the first problem is, at its basis is a communication issue. I mean, when I went, as you can tell by my accent, I went to graduate school in London, right? So when I went there in 1989, my mom and my dad were freaking out because they were saying, oh my gosh, it's Europe, there's terrorism there. And I was able to show them figures. I said, look, I was born in Los Angeles County. My chances of dying of violent death are greater as a male in Los Angeles County than there are if I were a British soldier in Northern Ireland.
Especially with your crack habit.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I was scuba diving then. Another expensive habit. There's that perception. Americans think, when I go to the Middle East, and I go frequently, the greatest threat is of traffic. You know that. Right. And the Saudis will tell you that. But everybody freaks out over terrorism. I worked in the Pentagon for 12 years, the 9/11 attacks. So there is that perception. That's problem number one. Problem number two is, and again, this goes back to the Obama, Trump, Biden thing. Trump was so, used phrases like my favorite dictator, stuff like that, which allowed his political adversaries in the other party to stand against him. And, Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states, none of them are democracies. And so it's very easy for a person who wanted to score a point on Trump to say, okay, we're against this. The problem is they've painted themselves into a corner. And now that they're in power, you have this elaborate game where President Biden refuses to take a phone call from Mohammed bin Salman, who, everybody knows is running the show in the kingdom because it's not his parallel. Mohammed bin Zayed in the UAE is only the crown prince of Abu Dhabi. Are you not going to take his call? Theoretically, Boris Johnson is not Joe Biden's parallel. Queen Elizabeth is. She's the head of state. There's a lot of ridiculousness that, is over the Khashoggi murder and things that were said in the primaries that, the president is painting himself into a corner, and it has to do with the internal dynamics of the Democratic Party, which, elements of it have moved further to the left. Mm-hmm. And then the final problem is just institutionally, things like Patriot batteries are high demand, low density. And when you deploy a Patriot battery on an emergency basis to Abqaiq in 2019, people tend to forget that the soldiers who come with that, those are guys who have probably been, on a remote air base in the Middle East for a year. And they were promised, okay, this is your year back at Fort Bliss or Fort Sill. And, you can go to your kid's high school graduation, all that. And all of a sudden, nope, sorry, back to the desert. And so what you see is that the sergeants, you can't just hire guys for a Patriot battery. You have to build them over years. A lot of those guys weren't re-enlisting. There is stress on the force, and it's not just equipment, it's also the personnel. And, so people tend to overlook that. And so there's a lot of factors that reinforce what at the end of the day is a fundamental insecurity, which is, how committed is the United States to us? We live in this region, you don't. And so whenever it looks like we're diminishing our participation in the region, the fears come to the forefront.
That's interesting when you talk about perceptions when there are American troops on the ground. The host nations come to think of them as their own, and it's also what you just said about the basic bureaucracy of an entity, an organism as large as the U.S. military, and taking care of its people. And there's always the assumption that it's a bottomless well in terms of capacity and availability and capability, which anybody that's in the military knows it's not that. It's a plenty nightmare.
Oh yeah. Oh no, and this is a universal problem. Just in the domestic context, we've got Corona surging here, and you hear all these governors say we need to call out the National Guard. And it's like, well, the National Guard they're not kept hermetically sealed. These are people who have jobs, and particularly if you say you want a medical person from the National Guard or the Army Reserve. Well, they're part-time soldiers. If they are in a medical specialty, the chances are pretty good they're working in their civilian capacity in a medical job. So if you call them out as National Guardsmen, you're going to see like a doctor leaving his job at one hospital to put on a uniform and work at another hospital. What have you gained? That's in the domestic context. It's the same thing in the international context. You've got countries that are like, well, why aren't there soldiers here? What are they doing? And the answer is, they're people and they're on a cycle. And when you had that deployment to abdicate, you disrupted that cycle. And that hurts the institution.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just as an aside, that example you just made is very close to home. My son's, a very good friend of my son's, is a nurse in San Antonio with the Army. So she's there with the hospital there. She spent the last 6 months in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, helping out people because hard hit areas that have been hard hit by COVID and who can't get nurses and can't pay the nurses to get them to come in. So the military is trying to fill this gap domestically, and it's a real challenge.
Yeah.
As I said, it's not a bottomless well, and you can't just go to it whenever you have a need.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, Afghan refugees have been settled at Fort Bliss, Texas. And I've heard informally, so I don't know how true this is, that the entire 1st Armored Division is basically consumed with that mission. So we only have 9 divisions in the U.S. Army, and you've got one of those offline doing an extraneous mission. And the problem, I was the Department of Defense's liaison at the Department of Homeland Security for 3 years. And I noticed in all the planning for hurricanes, earthquakes, pandemic influenza, terrorist strikes, the rest of the U.S. government would plan up to wildfires. They'd plan up to a certain point, and then they'd say, call in the Department of Defense. So we do that domestically. There was like this mental line where the problem became too hard, and they said, "Oh, we'll give it to the Department of Defense."
we can't think about this anymore.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Well, another question, and maybe this is our next segment is going to be on Saudi efforts to build a military industry. But how do we deal with what they're dealing with now? What is actually sort of characteristic of modern warfare, and these are asymmetrical, low cost, drones, missiles that are very difficult to defend against, and as you pointed out in your excellent article, extremely expensive. We're basically trading $20,000 at the most, for a souped up drone for $1 million Patriot. How
$4 million Patriot?
Oh, all right, there you go. Yeah, inflation. I didn't know inflation hit so quickly.
Well, and no, it's a good point. Well, theoretically, if you look at Vision 2030, if it holds, smaller states have an advantage in this new warfare because they're nimble and they haven't invested all the money in the big infrastructure that we have. So if you go to the U.S. Navy and give them any problem, and listen to their answers, how would you solve this? You'll realize that their thinking is, how can we base the possible solution to this on an aircraft carrier or a littoral combat ship? They tend to think in terms of the systems they have and justifying those. Saudi Arabia has imported all that. They don't have that domestically. And they're trying to build a domestic defense industry. You start small. So they have, 11 areas of emphasis in their defense industry. One of them is developing UAVs. Another one is developing the maintenance and overhaul, repair and overhaul for UAVs. So, theoretically, starting from a base there where you don't have those fixed costs, and you succumb to the gambler's dilemma, where you say, we've spent so much on this, we have to justify it. This is what the U.S. Navy does with aircraft carriers. Then you can move more nimbly. Approach these things with a clean sheet and say, okay, how can we defeat these? And so another one of these, another two of the Saudi things are directed energy, and they're also looking at development of defense electronics, electronic warfare. Those are promising areas for counter drone defense.
Fascinating. We're going to make you repeat that for our next segment. But I had one more question that I think fits into this security situation. And Lucien, jump in. I'm sure. I've been rolling along here. Saudi 2022 defense budget for Saudi, they're cutting it 10%, and this is the 5th consecutive year they've cut it. So it's going down from 57 billion to 45.5 billion. And as we know, Saudi Arabia has been a reliable, purchaser of arms and at extraordinary levels with regard to its GDP. What do you make of that?
It's kind of normal. I mean, first off, a lot of the Saudi defense budget does not equal what is spent to defend the Saudi state. So, you've got the National Guard, you've got new presidential security. A lot of the Ministry of the Interior serves as a sort of army. There's still a lot more there than we think. But I think a lot of the spikes reflected procurement spikes. So the F-15 recapitalization is on course and trickling down. We've seen the completion of the Patriot modernization. We're told that there'll be another modernization and expansion of Patriot the next few years, but that's not baked into the budget. So, hopefully if there is effective reform, at least in the short term, things that are produced in Saudi Arabia are going to be more expensive than they could be produced overseas. But if Saudi Arabia actually manages to achieve a true sustained defense industrial base, you should, within about 10 years, I think, start to see costs fall down. Right now, this is a cynical view, but I'm a cynical dude. So far, what Saudi Arabia is succeeding in doing in domestic defense production is building the most expensive, metal boxes for an Apache helicopter fire control unit. But as, learning and industries take root, if they do, you should see efficiencies and price reductions. And Saudi Arabia will start getting more bang for the buck instead of less.
So let's make the pivot official.
Absolutely.
Sure. And let's talk a little bit about
don't say pivot with the Saudis.
Yes, we're now going to talk about Taiwan.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the homegrown defense industry in Saudi Arabia. Under Vision 2030, the kingdom said it is seeking to localize 50% of its military expenditure. Richard just talked in our last segment. And for our YouTube viewers who are watching these as segments, make sure you listen to the other segment where we talk about the U.S. Saudi security balance, because there's a lot in there. But the kingdom spent $190 billion on the military in 2021. But for 2022, that budgeted spend is coming down to 171 billion riyals, $46 billion. This may be good news for Saudi Arabia if and when it's achieved, but potentially concerning for U.S. defense contractors. Dave, let's talk a little bit about sort of the homegrown defense industry in Saudi Arabia. Where is it now? Is this 50% of its localization achievable by 2030? Let's dive into it a little bit.
Yeah, good question. So I got to take it back to Burger King. And 5 years ago, if you saw Saudi and Burger King, working there, and he probably wasn't working, he was probably wearing a uniform, standing behind the counter, but that was like seeing a zebra walking down, Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington. And now you routinely see Saudis working in jobs that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. So when you look at the defense industry, the question is, are you going to just, sort of funnel maquiladora tasks, like importing weapons as kits and assembling them, bolting them and welding them, and then saying, okay, that's done? Or are you going to actually have a truly sustained defense space? To get a true defense industry, you look at countries that have done this, and I know they're not going to like this, but a real success is Iran. And what Iran has that Saudi Arabia doesn't have is a 20-year head leap. They started this in the 50s under the Shah, where they started training not just scientists, which is what things like King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, the science base, that's good. But what you really need are engineers, little less trained, little less theoretical, taking existing science and harnessing it to solve problems. That's a little harder and it's not as prestigious. And then you need trained workers, craftsmen, people like welders. And there's a universal shortage in this. When Australia wanted to build its own submarines, it realized the problem was it had scientists, it had engineers, didn't have welders to actually weld the holes on submarines. And these are skills. And the first question I saw when I read Vision 2030 for the first time is, are they going to be able to get Saudis to work in factories on these unglamorous things like, welding, testing, metal fabrication? Or are they going to have factories located in Saudi Arabia, but have third country nationals actually doing the work? Will the Saudis show up on time? Will all these problems you have whenever you open a factory, in South Carolina or something like that? What we're seeing is it's looking like it's working pretty well, but it's going to take a long time. The Saudis' incentive structures tend to reward people who sit in offices and write papers. They have to be modified to, give that same level of status and reward to somebody who works as a welder. And that's going to take a long time. That's going to take about a generation. But the social change has already happened more rapidly than I would have predicted. I mean, I don't know if you guys agree with that assessment.
Absolutely. The pace is shocking. And we've talked a little bit about on the social aspect, there may be some pullback or some repercussions, but we've done a segment on the automotive industry. We've done a segment on the mining industry, and many of the motivations are the same. There's an overlay of a strategic need in terms of the military industry. All three of these, auto, mining, military, they fall under their National Industrialization Development Program. And they all look at it as not only having an economic rationale, but particularly job creation. And when you fill out the full ecosystem, all sorts of ancillary jobs and these sort of things. But that issue that you just put your finger on right out of the gate, who's qualified to do these jobs, and how long will it take to get there? And that informs everything about Vision 2030. Is you can rewrite law, you can implement reforms, you can move ahead here and there, but you still have to the training up a generation of Saudis capable of doing this takes a generation. Yeah. And the governor of the General Authority for Military Industries, GAMI, Ahmed Al-Othli, talks sort of openly about this. He says, one of the things we have to do is upskill, and we're going to do. That was very interesting what you mentioned earlier about the establishment of a national defense university. This is not the same thing, but he talks about a lot of our early work is got to be upskilling young Saudis. Yeah. And I appreciate it. He was in the UK at a defense show. And he said, that 50% by 2030, I think he essentially was saying, yeah, maybe not. But that's what we're shooting for. No pun intended. But yeah, that that always comes back to, if you get, we want to create jobs, and we're talking $100,000 in this military industry, that 100,000 jobs that they'd like to see. But you got to train them, you got to educate them, you got to find them.
Yeah, and it's going to be hard, because if I were an individual factory owner, I would lean towards, okay, I've got a factory in Saudi Arabia, I got guys working here, I'm going to hire Bangladeshis at a fraction of the price. And so there has to be a level of, and I think the fact that this is a national program, I think there's going to be some acceptance of inefficiencies. People are going to say, yes, we are not doing this as efficient as we can because we are educating our workforce. I think that's a part of it. And so, they've got to build the skilled craftsman workforce. And this is a challenge. I mean, this is why, there are angry people who've put in a deposit on Tesla and can't get them, because Elon Musk neglected that. He just felt, oh yeah, I just hire people and tell them screw on bolts. He didn't realize that there's actually a level of craft that comes in there. We neglect craft. We focus on intellect and to a certain extent on engineering. We neglect craft, but there is craft in manufacturing. And then the engineering culture, which is also hard to do because it requires critical thinking. It requires questioning assumptions, things that culturally have not been encouraged in the Saudi context, particularly in Saudi government. But that engineering culture, can take root relatively quickly. And, when I look at, a medium-sized state with an engineering culture, I look at the current hot weapon is the Turkish TB2 Bayraktar drone. You talk to, a casual observer of the military, and they'll say, oh yeah, the TB2 won the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Well, that's not the case, but it is an effective drone. It's killed 23 of the Russian self-Panzer, S-1 Panzer, which 5 years ago, after the Abkhaz attack, the Russians were like, oh yeah, just buy these and that'll solve your problem. It's killed 23 of those. And everybody wants it. There's nothing on there that's revolutionary. A lot of those components were just bought on the open market. The gimbal is Canadian, and it's assembled. That taking these components and integrating them and then perfecting it so that, you've got the ideal compromise between weight and distance, that's engineering. That's really a process of critical thinking applied to various systems here. That is an achievable goal for the kingdom within 5-10 years. So,
there's so much in that you just said, but some of it fun, some of it actually on topic. So I'll go with the on topic one. Although I have to mention, some of
you want on topic, get another guest.
Someone.
I'm trying to stay on topic because when you mentioned that Turkish drone, what these images of all these Russian mechanized vehicles with these jury-rigged grids on them.
In the Ukraine,
and because they're terrified of this, and they and I don't know that these work, but it's just odd-looking sort of extensions and grids and that sort of thing, hoping to somehow deter this drone. And one more digression. Speaking of Elon Musk, I gather he delayed the introduction of the X model by 2 years because he wanted those gull-wing doors. And just as you say, the engineers looked around and said, okay, how do we make this feasible in any kind of production, scalability?
Yeah.
So anyway, but to the point about uneconomical, and I think, people look at Saudi Arabia and a lot of people just don't get it. And a lot of people, in my opinion, go, well, these goals are outrageous. They're overly ambitious. They're just, they're not based in reality. And my response is that's not the point.
Yeah.
The point is the direction they're heading. And part of this commitment in terms of Vision 2030 is really a planned inefficiency. So when they talk about an automotive industry and Lucid coming there in some 25, 26 and opening up a manufacturing process, well, this is going to entail enormous incentives.
Yeah.
Not efficient incentives, but that's not the point. The point is they're trying to develop an automotive industry. Same with mining, which we just did. They have They've just rolled out a whole new mining plan effective January 2021, that has significant incentives. I look at the Saudization, the nitakat, and if you look at that, anytime you mandate employment levels, it's economically inefficient. Yep. And there's studies all over that say, the result was that the good companies that were moving along well and had export levels and were fairly efficient got hit. But again, the point was we want to we'll go one step back in order to get two steps forward. Yeah. And so much of what they're doing is exactly this, and it sounds like this is sort of what we'll be seeing in their efforts to develop a military industry.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Look, there's two, when you look at Vision 2030, which really is a remarkable document, there's two things that bring you to the military section of it. The first one is that's the one area that the state can turn on and off like a tap. Everything else, getting people to exercise, unless you're North Korea, you're not going to do that. But the military, they can say, we're going to buy this stuff. We're not going to buy this stuff. We need it. We don't. So that's the first thing. And I think when you look at achieving Vision 2030 goals, the military goals are actually better than most. And I think that in some instances, some of the targets for things like local production of the Saudi National Guard are actually going to be accelerated. They're actually going to be achieved ahead of time schedule. I think that may be part of the reason why the Vanel contract was terminated for the ground force training in the Saudi National Guard. But yeah, there's always, if you have a national security premium, if you decide that it is a national security interest of ours to have a trained workforce at the scientist, engineering, and craftsman level, so that we can produce our own weaponry, so that if the Germans get angry at us over the murder of Jamal Khashoggi or the Yemen war, they cut us off, we can fabricate our own parts, then you pay a premium. And people criticize that because we look at it as Westerners where we have to be cost effective, but let's face facts, the Saudis are rich. They're not as rich as everybody thinks they are, but they're still rich. And if they overpay, so what? That's their comparative advantage. And it strikes me as being a wise approach to develop a self-sustainable defense industry, if that's what they really want.
Mm-hmm. There's a upcoming defense industry event held in Saudi Arabia. It's going to be the first of its kind. The World Defense Show begins on March 6th in Riyadh. That's also really interesting. It's usually in the UAE, or there's usually a competing event in the UAE, but this is the first that will be in Riyadh. Interesting timing with everything. Just wanted to add that in there. There should be very interesting participants in that show as well.
Yeah. That's they're really promoting that. I guess that's their first one, and they've got a purpose-built site. They think it'll make some money, and they claim to be the only one that covers all 5 domains of defense: land, air, sea, security, and space.
This is not a paid plug.
I'm waiting on my invitation.
Oh yeah, that'd be great. Do you think you might be there?
I will be in the region. I have a CENTCOM thing on March 10th, but other than that, I'm pretty much free. Yeah.
So if anyone from GAMI is listening to this podcast, we have a 30-year veteran that's looking for an invite. So let's get that his way.
And once again, we cannot emphasize this enough. If anybody from PIF is listening, we're happy with Lucid Air. We don't need the top of the line.
We'll take it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. No, I'll take the bells and whistles, though. Since we're asking.
So Dave, before we go, we don't need to leave the subject, but there's the General Authority for Military Industries, which is sort of the regulatory body. Yeah. And there's the Saudi Arabian military, SAMI, S-A-M-I, right, which is really sort of like a company that's out engaging and trying to partner with and I think there's some confusion often as to the regulatory body and actually what SAMI is.
Yeah.
And we talked some time back about trying to figure that one out. But it's going to be interesting because when you look at the companies that seem to be out there engaging and partnering with other companies, SAMI is one. Advanced Electronics Corporation is another. Both PIF owned. PIF, Public Investment Fund. I mean, Alzamo does marine stuff, but there's not a lot of private sector groups out there that I'm aware of. And
well, yeah, El Salam, sort of joint ventures with like American firms and Saudi firms. Yeah. I mean, the way it was explained to me, the way SAMI will work is sort of as a tech incubator. So it takes on risky areas that the market won't ordinarily do, and it sort of, brings it along with partners, and then eventually steps back and allows private industry. That has been an effective model for some areas. Silicon Valley has had a lot of that, and some of the Route 128 tech firms around Boston. There's actually a tech incubator co-located with Northeastern University's drone lab. I've brought Saudi military officers there in the past. But for it to work, and I'm sorry, this is like the fourth time I've mentioned this, usually in context of Donald Trump. I'm sorry to get all West Point on you. It requires discipline. And it's very, very hard. SAMI has to identify, first off, key areas, invest in it, and then have the discipline to withdraw and let the project run. And that's a hard thing to do if you're showing results, particularly in the Saudi bureaucratic concept, to step back. I'm not sure how workable that's going to be.
By the way, that's sort of the hanging question with the PIF in general. Yeah. In terms of the whole economy. But you referenced it in our other segment on the U.S. Saudi security relationship. You talked about the advantages of starting from nothing, a blank slate, and being able to target industries. Can you recapitulate that for us a little bit?
Well, basically what I said was that if you have a domestic industry that's already well established, the natural tendency is, people have jobs, you have industrial development, and you try to force whatever the problem is, whatever the solution is, into those existing components. So, you give a problem like drone defense to the U.S. Navy. Their question is, okay, how can we get aircraft carriers in the Zumwalt class destroyer to deal with drones? It's very, very hard for people to move off of that. One of the big arguments I have with the U.S. Air Force is one of the problems with the U.S. Air Force is the pilot pipeline. And, it costs so much to train a pilot. When drones come online, the Air Force said, yeah, we'll take drones, but they insisted that every drone be flown by a trained pilot, so that you cannot replace a manned aircraft with a drone because you're still going through the same bottleneck. Bureaucratically, they continue to do that. Saudi Arabia has, in theory, along with other countries, medium-sized countries, Turkey's drone success is a good example of this. They can start with a blank sheet and just say, okay, what's best, what's most effective, what's most cost-effective. They can do that without having the investment in other industries. And this isn't just an American problem. So much of France's arms sales are driven by a need to keep the Le Havre shipyards opened. If you look at instances, with conflicts with France over weapon sales in the past 5 years, so much of it is driven by the need to keep that ancient, founded by Cardinal Richelieu shipyard open, to keep them busy. So Saudi Arabia doesn't have that. They literally are starting. They have other disadvantages. They don't have the culture of 9-to-5 workmanship. They don't have the culture of craft. But I would have thought 6 years ago it was impossible to see Saudis working in fast food, and they are. So,
fascinating stuff.
This is good stuff, Dave. You're a rock star.
We talk about this podcast.
It's the tie.
Richard, we love doing this because we learn when we're doing this, but I don't know if we've learned more in one episode than this episode, so this has been really great. Let's move on to the Yallah segment, Saudi in a minute, and we'll wrap this up.
Saudi in a minute.
Yallah. Richard, if you want to get us going, just get us started. And David, you go ahead and weigh in, just in response.
First one, foreign ministers from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman, and Bahrain, and the Secretary General of the Gulf Cooperation Council arrived in Beijing on Monday for a 5-day visit to further negotiations over a China-GCC free trade agreement and strengthening of China's economic ties with the bloc. The first ever coordinated visit by a GCC delegation is being seen by experts as, quote-unquote, historically unprecedented and a positive step towards achieving a China-GCC free trade agreement. It is striking. I mean, when you consider that we had the foreign ministers of 4 countries, 4 GCC states coming here, and the head of the GCC, it's a big thing, and it's being treated as such.
Yeah, I suppose as a jingoistic American, it's I'm happier seeing the GCC as a bloc engaging with China than individual GCC states. China's game is to generally pick people off and get them to do it. I suppose if there's a consonant GCC trade policy, that makes it that sort of negates China's advantage, which tends to be sort of playing on the margins or outside the rules. So right. I suppose it's a positive development from American interests.
But it is interesting how a regional trade alliance seems less threatening than a bilateral one.
That's right. A series of bilateral ones, because then you get like a race to the bottom, and China will be able to exact concessions and things like that. So I suppose if they have trade with China. Ironically enough, we guarantee that trade through our robust military presence in the Gulf. They don't seem very grateful for it. I suppose the least damaging way is if it's a common trade policy.
The Chinese thank you note is in the mail.
Well, we have a little bit of cognitive dissonance over this because, on the one hand, you see U.S. government people complain about, we provide the trade for them. And it's like, okay, so what if the Chinese took us up and said, yeah, you're exactly right. We've got 3 aircraft carriers. We'll station one of them permanently in the Gulf. Everybody in Washington would have an aneurysm. So, we complain about it, but we don't want them to do anything about it. We have our own cognitive dissonance in the United States.
Yeah.
Second topic, authorities in Saudi Arabia are preparing to launch the 2022 census, which will be the 5th in the kingdom's history. The last Gen Pop and housing census in the kingdom took place in 2010, and the total population at that time was 27,136,977. This is according to the General Authority for Statistics. The World Bank estimated the kingdom's population now at 34.8 million in 2020. Interesting.
Yeah. Mo data, mo better.
And
that's the motto of the
Mo data, mo better. I like that. Somebody wrote a rap song, didn't they?
That's right.
Your reference earlier, so many things about Saudi Arabia, not emerging country, but a developing country, that there's disadvantages that you don't have legacy systems, and advantages that you don't have legacy systems, and you see this, and when they're trying to implement Fourth Industrial Revolution technologies, oh great, we can sort of just adopt this whole hog, but this will be the first census that is done technologically. They're using modern technologies, and you run into that often with Saudi Arabia. People aren't aware that they couldn't even keep track of who was employed by this or that. So this will be their first, they'll use, comprehensive modern technology for the first time and counting their populations.
Yeah, and they're not, some of the problems we have in the U.S. government is, we have equipment located on or data located on obsolete machines that just aren't made anymore. I mean, I still got some floppy disk stuff, and they're able to shift the generation. And one of the things that amazed me when I went to I deployed as a soldier to Bosnia in the wake of the war there, and this country was war torn. There were blown up houses everywhere, but the cell phone service was better than in the United States because we had invested all this money in laying wire and then in laying fiber optic cables, and they went straight to cellular and towers. Right. And so even though this country was war torn and there was hunger and famine and cold, their cell phone service was better than ours. And the Saudis are in a good position to take advantage of that. They're coming to it late. Can I give you a couple other things I'd like to see data collected on?
Absolutely.
Okay, I got 2 things. So the first thing is, and I learned this when I worked narcotics in the 90s. I was in the Clinton White House drug office. Data is the key to everything. And one of the things that would be really helpful would be if there was like an annual or semi-annual survey of attitudes towards corruption, ease of doing business in the government, public attitudes towards different things, the economy, that would give you a baseline to do that. And, that would just be wonderful. It would be hard to get Saudi to agree to do that because, it's not as open a society. But, then you could measure things like how effective is Vision 2030? Is it working on this, that, and the other? The second thing, and this I'd like to see done in the United States as well. This sounds weird, but trust me, it's really good. Systematic samplage of wastewater treatment and sewage. We're able to tell in cities that do this, New York City does this, they're able to measure what the actual COVID rate is by sewage samples. And same things with drug abuse, even, all of our indications of drug abuse are indirect. They're like arrests or hospital rooms admissions. But you could find out if you, by sampling wastewater, and because it's so consolidated in the kingdom, it's a lot easier to do than it would be in the United States. And you could get, public health data on substance abuse, data on pollution, just a host of data for marginal cost.
Well, fascinating. One of the yellow topics is drug interdiction in Saudi, but those are excellent suggestions. And it would be interesting on the census if it has any additional questions other than the basic informational one. Yellow number 3. The Final Four style Spanish Super Cup returned to Saudi Arabia after a 1-year pandemic hiatus. Held in Riyadh this year as opposed to Jeddah in 2019. From January 12 to the 16th, Super Cup features La Liga teams Barcelona, Real Madrid, Atletico Madrid, and Athletic. And I gather they just started. So in the first semi, I guess Real Madrid beat Barcelona. I was going to say Barcelona.
Oh, I'm impressed.
The real.
No, because it's a poser, but it's highly just completely poser. But I have a good friend living in Barcelona at the moment. But anyway, so Real Madrid beat the B guys 3-2 yesterday.
One of the things that always irritates me is like listening to the radio when people will speak in English and then they say, when I was in Los Angeles, I had a burrito. But you, occasionally I find myself saying Abu Dhabi, and then I have to slap myself for going like that, or I say Riyadh instead of Riyadh, Well, this goes back to the golf, doesn't it? It's a prestige event. I'm amazed at just how popular soccer is in, actually anywhere, because it's such a boring game. I tend to think only communists watch it, but God, they play for 3 hours and it's a draw. It's basically hockey on Xanax. And the other thing, of course, is if you dive in hockey, you get a penalty.
Oh, my goodness.
Plus, you get the crap beaten out of you the next time you're on the ice. But this is a good thing, I think. I'm sure there'll be critics. I'm sure that the Saudis are overpaying. They have to at this point. But if this can take root, it is a good thing. And I really do believe that sport is, it is a function. It brings about international reconciliation. So why not?
I'll add to your list of grievances against soccer is when they score a goal and they run away from their teammates. Just
that's right.
It irritates the heck out of me.
It was all
right.
me.
Football,
exactly.
They all bunch into each other. That's right.
But this Spanish Super Cup, it's really interesting. I mean, and obviously they just spent $400 million and $420 million in Newcastle. It looks like it's $1 billion for a big chunk of Inter Milan, which is what they're talking about. So this is a 10-year deal worth close to $350 million. Yeah. And again, it does tie back into what they're trying to build a football culture in Saudi Arabia. They have a very strong football culture, actually. So there's a love of it, but they're really trying to build it into a really significant part of society. So it's fascinating. Everything that's involved with it.
Staying with that theme. I guess this is the fourth now. According to a report this week in Reuters, Qatar and Saudi Arabia have halted efforts at the WTO to resolve a dispute over the alleged privacy of content produced by Doha-owned sports and entertainment channel beIN. The two countries notified the WTO that they were mutually suspending their remaining requests before its dispute resolution body. Notices published by the WTO on Friday's show. Last January, an agreement signed by Gulf Arab leaders at a summit in Yallah, Saudi Arabia, ended the bitter dispute between Qatar and its neighbors, including Saudi Arabia. As part of that agreement, Reuters reports, Qatar agreed to terminate all legal battles connected to the dispute. This is interesting. This is over the privacy rights of soccer games broadcast in Saudi Arabia. Sort of like one of the last hatchet-burying actions between the two countries.
Yeah. Well, look. I mean, when you were in the kingdom, you'd see the beIN signal, and it'd have the thing in the bottom that said "Be out Q." And so what beIN did was they had their little bug crawling across the screen. Clearly it didn't show Saudi Arabia at its best light. And quite frankly, I'm sure that the Saudis have made some sort of a fiscal settlement. I think that's a good thing. I mean, one of the problems that in the long term on this, who cares? You can't watch soccer, but answers most of the world except for me. The fact that when the Qataris tried to sue, they couldn't get an attorney in the kingdom who would take their case. Mm-hmm. And that becomes an issue of rule of law and safety of investments and protection of intellectual property that in the long run hurts the kingdom. It basically shows that this is not a rule of law system where, if you invest your money, your rights will be protected. It didn't do that. So I think it's in the interest of the kingdom to do that. It's in the interest of the kingdom to make the Qataris whole and happy. And I think that this is an episode that is best in the past, and that hopefully there will be another precedent that kind of shows this sort of thing won't happen in the future.
Yeah, it's nice to see, and we've talked about it. It's nice to see some diplomacy breaking out, and this is good. MBS just made a tour of most of the Gulf states, and the GCC just had their 42nd summit in Riyadh in December. And there seems to be a real effort to smooth down some of these sharp edges and remove these sticking points. And this is a good thing. And it was interesting. They just Saudi and the Qataris are talking about a railway now, and so the comedy is back, and as in COMITY. I mean, it's a little more friendly, and I think it's significantly more comfortable. Yeah, for all these states involved to be working in this way in a little more cooperative manner.
Yeah, and you're right. That rail is long overdue. I mean,
oh my goodness.
Given the precariousness of logistics in the Gulf, the fact that you don't have Red Sea ports and even Indian Ocean ports linked to countries on the Gulf itself. That's just like logistical malpractice.
It's been coming since 2009, and they recommitted at the summit in December, and it'd be nice to see it happen. It's really got. I think that they 8,000 kilometers is what they'd like to do. Mm-hmm. They're not. I think they're not yet halfway there. But they just opened a road. Saudis and Omanis just opened a road. I think what was that? 900 kilometers.
900 tough kilometers.
It cut that trip by 13 hours. I gather. So these things. Yeah. These are the nuts and bolts of an economy and society that you don't just happen, but you got to make happen. So hopefully this on the rail that'd be really significant. Number 5. In 2021, Saudi Arabia seized more than 37 tons of illegal drugs, as well as 190 million pieces of the highly addictive Captagon pills. The haul included hashish, heroin, cocaine, khat, and other narcotics. In addition, authorities seized more than 234,000 bottles and 4,155 liters of smuggled alcohol. The campaign against drugs came as part of the Zakat Tax and Customs Authority's mission to protect society, support the national economy, and improve international trade, according to a Saudi press agency report.
Yeah. So this is a big issue, and this is where I think wastewater monitoring would help. Seizures are one example of success. Captagon is a huge problem. We now know that the Syrian state, the Bashar al-Assad regime, finances itself in large part from Captagon, also Hezbollah. So these are enemies of the Saudi state who do this. And while I don't subscribe to the more lurid novel that they're trying to hollow out society from within, it's true that the enemies of the Saudi state are making money from this. But the trade is robust, and it will continue. And what we've learned from the expansion of methamphetamine in the United States, which was an emerging issue when I was working narcotics in the Clinton administration, and now is just devastating, is that the drugs get cheaper, they get more effective, and what you're seeing is from the use of this, you get a number of people who have to be removed from the productive part of society at very great expense and taken care of. And, that's a challenge. The authoritarian instincts of the Saudi state have always been there with regard to these substances. Perhaps a liberalization on alcohol, which, was legal in the kingdom until the reign of King Saud, would allow them to focus more resources on this. And then I would just urge that they look at back-end monitoring to get a better indication of the prevalence of narcotics abuse around the kingdom, so that they could then shift focuses geographically if they see spikes and things like that.
I couldn't possibly add to that. That's an excellent response.
Mo data, mo better.
There you go. And
Marcos Arabia coming up.
As we see, everything returns to wastewater.
I tell you, wastewater. I don't want to get all call Weber on you, but wastewater really is the foundation of a society.
My goodness.
You do not have a civilization unless you have wastewater and wastewater treatment.
I'm on a well here, so if you were to sample my water, you would be able to pinpoint exactly what's in it because of me. So,
well, at the moment, it's all cocoa.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I just wanted to add that khat is a very regional drug. Like, it just does not exist over here. What is it? Like, I can't really figure out. Is it coca leaf, or is it its own kind of plant? But it's like a stimulant, sort of like. Yeah.
Good question. So I never really worked on khat because it was seen, you're right, in the United States, it was a boutique thing amongst Somali and Yemeni immigrants. And so when it was seized, it's of the tea family, as is cocaine. So the freshness of khat is a big deal. So it would be a fascinating PhD in economics, how you have Yemen, which is a failed state, racked with civil war, and yet you have a very effective, khat market, which manages to harvest this stuff and deliver it all around the Horn of Africa within a matter of hours, because it goes off. And the other thing is, when you go around Sana'a, and I haven't been to Sana'a since 2011 for obvious reasons, you see a number of men walking around. They have people do wear traditional dress there, to include the gambia, the curved knife, and you'll see men walking where they just have the scabbard but not the knife, and that's because they've pawned the knife for that day's hit. And then when they get money or whatever, they redeem their gambia and put it in for khat. So it's considered to be a mild narcotic, sort of like the way people are increasingly using gummies with that's about the closest I can get to it.
Edibles. Yeah, it would be legalized in Colorado.
All right, last one, gentlemen. We'll put a bow on today's conversation with this. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs Financial Tracking Services showed that Saudi Arabia ranked 6th among the world's most generous donors, providing 3% of global humanitarian aid. In October 2021, the kingdom ranked third among the world's top donors, with its share of humanitarian assistance rising to 5%. Saudis are generous.
Yeah. It's amazing how little credit they get for that, isn't it?
Oh boy, you put your finger on it. It's interesting, and I've been intrigued by this because they're getting a little better about letting this stuff get out. Because we know the Saudis are generous. Muslims, and the zakat, the habit of zakat, almsgiving. It's part of one of the five pillars. It's a habit. It's a social conscience. Most Muslims have it, but a good Muslim will tell you, bringing attention to the act diminishes the act.
Yeah.
So they do this because they feel it's their responsibility as Muslims to do this, and responsibility as good human beings. So yes, the Saudis have been very active and very good donors in aid and development, that sort of thing, for decades. And as you just said, Dave, nobody's paid attention. It's coming out a little bit more, and I think the Saudis are happy about it. But the Saudis were like, "Oh, we do this because we think it's right. We don't want to bring attention to it." But come on, somebody say, somebody give us a little, some props.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think there's a dynamic which is unfortunate, and the United States suffers from it as well. We pay, I think, 25% of everything the United Nations does, and a lot of the humanitarian stuff, some missions it rises to 40%. But after a while, it's kind of like, I mentioned earlier how Saudis view these as our troops. They're stationed in the Americans' troops stationed in the kingdom. It just gets accepted as the normal baseline, and you don't get credit for it. I don't want to, teenage father, you don't do anything for me. It's like, wait a minute, you live in a house, you have a car.
Let me count the ways.
Yeah, I think there's just a sort of universal human nature to do that. The other thing that I think is good about Saudi philanthropy is, as we know, in the 80s and 90s, a lot of that was funneled into proselytization that wound up not where we want it, and now it seems to be much more in the humanitarian focus, which I think reflects good choices made by the Saudi leadership. But one of the big questions I've written on this is Saudi Arabia ever going to get a fair shake in the West? And because of the system of government, it's going to be a long, hard slog, and it's always going to be a hard sell. And in terms of, you look at hip people in the West, first off, they're aligned with the United States. Secondly, it's an authoritarian state. It's going to be hard to see them getting credit for their good deeds in the way that they should in absolute terms.
I think that's a great question. I think that's maybe absolutely a question for another episode. This episode has been terrific. Thank you, Dave.
Anytime.
Speaking of generosity, you've been very generous with your time, Dave. So thank you
only got to pull Chatty Cathy's string once, boys. Hey, we talked about wastewater. That's the key, and Patriot missiles, two of my favorite subjects.
And beating up on soccer too, which is
exactly.
Really
we got to rant.
Right.
Dave, that was awesome. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
It's a pleasure. It's an honor.